Okay, has everybody got excuse me, a handout?
Yes.
Yep. Today's topic is media effects. It's the first of two lectures about media audiences. Okay, I'm just going to introduce you to media effects, then we're going to watch a clip, then we'll talk about the history of the development of media effects as a very powerful media theory, and then we'll end with another clip. And actually today is going to be like an experiment in the sense that you are my audience, right? And I'm going to show you two different media, which one of them you probably have seen before, one of them I almost guarantee you haven't seen before. Okay, so this is going to be like a case study. And the case study I'm going to call the following. It's going to be called Planet Earth versus Patriarchy. Okay? Have you heard of a BBC program called Planet Earth?
Yes.
Yes? What do you know about it? Planet Earth. What is it?
Describe the planet.
It's a BBC documentary with David Attenborough. I've got the DVD here. Let's remind ourselves. BBC documentaries, public service broadcasting, documentary is showing the world, facticity, reality, external reality, objectivity, planet Earth. The BBC, traditionally, as a famous global documentary television production company, thinks that it can document the world in a neutral, objective way, right? BBC nature programs, wildlife programs are famous for their beauty, how beautiful the spectacle of the world, the image of the world, how beautiful nature is, how cuddly some animals are, how violent nature can be. It's all about kind of a, how should we say, a distant look at nature from the outside, right? A bit like, you know, think about Planet Earth, a bit like, you know, cameras in the sky, yeah, looking down. You might want to reconsider the notion of objective planet Earth. On planet Earth today, humans are in a huge conflict, okay? And one of the central conflicts is between, let's put it this way, not just patriarchy and planet Earth, but capitalism and planet Earth, right? These two different texts that I'm going to show you have very different approaches to planet Earth. And you as my test audience, as my sample audience, I want to see which one you like out of the two, which one you prefer, and more importantly, which one you believe, which one is more truthful. Okay? So, let's talk about media effects before I show you the first clip. Okay, would it help if I put the bullet points up here as we go? Yeah, should I just get that on the screen? It's a little bit time consuming, but I'm happy to do it. You're a bit quieter today, is that because of the camera? Don't be afraid. You could be famous.
Are you serious?
Am I serious? I'm always serious, you know me. Anyway, you're on the camera. You just said that. You said you're on camera. Historically, objectively speaking, that's what you said to me. Yeah. So
don't know what the end is.
See, in a way, what I'm trying to do, I'm being playful, is, you know, as soon as something is being filmed, right, people's behaviour changes. So how can you document reality if you go into the street with a camera and people are only saying things to the camera? They're not being themselves. Technology constructs reality. It does not just reflect reality. That's part of what I'm trying to say to you guys today in terms of media effects. But anyway, we'll come to that later when we talk about representation on the course. Let me just check that the technology is working, because I'm relying on a battery and it seems to be okay. So, historically speaking, we can talk about the mass society critique. This is the early media effects theory. It goes back to the, I would say, the first half of the 20th century. Remember, we can talk about the 20th century as the century of media and the advent of propaganda, okay? When, you know, the 20th century is the century of media. The only major media or media, plural, that weren't invented in the 20th century, books, newspapers, cinema, 1895, but television and everything that followed the internet is all 20th century. And so what I'm arguing today in the context of media effects is that when you can broadcast, do you remember the lecture on broadcast? Broadcast to the nation, the same way China is trying to broadcast to the Chinese nation and the world today to say, those Hong Kong people, they're really bad, they're terrorists, we need to do something about them, yeah? This is the idea of mass society, that you can use technology, you can use broadcast technology as a way of influencing people, a nation, a state, the world, if you're talking internationally. So mass society critique is basically a negative critique of the power of technology and media to influence masses. Everybody. The more popular, the more power. Now this links theoretically with two theories that we've been doing recently. If you recall last week, we talked about political economic approaches to the study of mass media. Political economic approaches believe that the most important way of understanding media is its power, its concentration of power, its ownership. So I would say that media effect, I'm not the only one to say this, media effects theory has quite a lot in common with political economic approaches and Marxist approaches and the Frankfurt School. Because in general, the whole idea behind media effects theory is that you, I'm looking at you, not me, okay, me too, are passive, right? That the power of the media is so powerful ideologically. Think about the Frankfurt School. Think about advertising ideology. Think about the unconscious. That it can influence millions of people at the same time in the same way. But one of the central questions that we need to ask ourselves is, does the media influence everybody in the same way? Or, you know, do we understand the audience to be homogeneous, singular, or are there different active ways of interpreting media messages, right? So the first thing to understand about media effects theorists is that they believe that the media is very, very, very powerful. Propaganda, advertising, just two examples, broadcast media, reality TV, social media, it goes on and on and on. So media effects theorists are concerned with social change, and they note in the 20th century that with the advent of mass media, particularly television in the 1950s, traditional society has started to break up. There has been a general move, sociologically, from the group, nation, society, towards the individual. It's not an exaggeration to say that in the average Western family today, people consume the media, even as a family, individually, right? when people are travelling around using their mobile phones. Look at the individual relationship that we all now have with our mobile phones. Cinema, way back in 1895 when it began, used to be a social affair. People used to go to the cinema to share the emotional experience, to feel part of a group. It's really changed. It's become individualised. One of the reasons it's become individualised is because of capitalism and neoliberalism. It's also to do with urbanisation. One of the general sociological arguments is that urbanisation has increased not anonymity, it's increased social isolation. Literally, as it's very unnatural to live in a city, especially like London, especially when you're not from London, and you're passing people every day, hundreds of people in the street that you don't know, that you probably never see again. It's very anonymous, it's very alienating, and so it makes us more dependent on our media to contact our friends, our family, because we are in a strange urban context. Urbanisation is quite alien, even to people who have lived in cities for years and years. People don't talk to their neighbours, people will sit next to each other on trains and buses, and they don't talk. The more we go into our screens, the less we talk to the person next to you who's on his or her screen. Isolation, anonymity. Media effects theorists believe that we are all vulnerable to powerful new media. Cinema, I mentioned, radio. So when these media were invented, there was a lot of moral panic about, oh my God, is cinema going to make society more immoral? Is radio going to lead to lots of propaganda? Is television going to corrupt young people's minds with violence and sex? And the same argument applies to the internet today. Even though the internet has now been around for, 25, 30 years, it's a relatively new medium. Look at all the scares that there have been about the power of the internet. What do people say about the power of the internet? Terrorism, cyberbullying, sex trafficking, pornography, the #1 use of the internet. Big moral panics about new media, right? So, let's go to moral panics. According to Sonia Livingston, each new medium produces a moral panic. Particular concern is media violence. One of the huge concerns of media effects theorists and theory in general is the power of violence in the media. Look at the media today. Look at Hollywood. Look at, I don't know, box sets, Netflix, some of the things that I'll be talking about at the end of the course. It's extremely violent. Yes? Why are films classified? Because children shouldn't be allowed to see violence, they shouldn't be allowed to see explicit sexual imagery, but it's there because why is sex and violence so powerful why is it there? Why do people watch sex and violence? Why do they?
It's just like yourself to feel bad. You can find the violence, the deeper violence inside of the movies that you can.
Pleasure. Pleasure. People get pleasure from watching sex and violence. They get pleasure from violence because obviously it's not real violence, it's not happening to you, and there's a strange emotional ambivalent relationship between watching violence happening to somebody on a screen and violence that's not happening to you. You feel safe. It's called voyeurism. Has anybody heard of voyeurism? Yeah? Human beings, but maybe media technology has played a historical role in promoting this. Yeah? Voyeurism is about watching at a distance. Yes? Human beings, through the media, are accustomed, even through the news, to watching people suffering, watching sexual images at a distance and getting pleasure from it. Right? So one of the big moral scares about media effects is, does violence in the media, does sex in the media, does it make young people more sexually immoral? Does it make young people more violent? These are the things that people talk about. Yeah? Is there a direct effect between media, sex and violence and human behaviour. What do you think? Does it make us more violent, watching violence? Does watching violence make us violent?
Yes, unconsciously.
Unconsciously. Would you like to explain that fact?
You don't realize you are changed by watching the violence movie, but you unconsciously changed by watching the kind of
I
movie.
agree with you. I totally agree with you. If you are exposed, and science does bear this out to a certain extent, if you are constantly expose yourself to violent images that are very realistic, the next time you see violence in the real world, maybe you're walking down the street and there's a car accident or somebody falls over and has a heart attack, maybe you are going to think, oh, that's kind of normal, I don't need to do anything. The argument could be that it's making human beings less empathetic, less compassionate, and worse than that, it's blurring the line between fact and fiction. Because, let's face it, media is pretty good at making violence look real and feel real, right? So the argument is, and there is evidence, scientific evidence to support this, that ultimately it's making us less compassionate about real violence that's happening in the world. The next point is moral panics shape the research agenda. So what that is saying, and I think the best way to probably explain that is talking about the internet again. If, as a media, I know this firsthand as a kind of media scholar myself, the best way to get funding, if you want to do a media PhD or later in your lives, or it's certainly true now, it might not be true by the time you do it, is the best way to get funding today in the media studies universities and faculties is to do research on the internet. So what we're saying is that because there's a lot of fear and academic questions being asked about the power of the internet on audiences, there's money is being invested in institutions, academic institutions, for researchers to research and write about and document what these effects might be. But there's a problem here. Part of the problem is that well, first of all, why just focus on the internet? And also there's a lot of money in new media and digital media. And so it creates a kind of bias as a researcher. So as a researcher, you want to be successful, but if you can only get funding to support, it might be IBM, it might be Google, it might be Facebook that funds you to do research on the internet. Yeah? So automatically it's creating a bias, a research. If you're being funded by a big digital media company to do research, is your research going to be neutral? You know the answer to that, yeah? But these moral panics about violence on the internet, you know, they are shaping the research. It means that more money is being given to researchers in the areas where money is invested in digital media and so on. And the big problem, according to Barker and Petley, one of the big problems is that these moral panics actually distract us from real-world social problems. I think this is a general problem. Increasingly, we're spending so much time on our screens that we are losing our ability to actually notice what's happening in the real world. Yeah? So panics about the power of the internet and thinking about the internet is actually taking the focus away from the real world. Okay, it's time to show you the first clip. I'm going to show you BBC Planet Earth. You don't have to have an opinion about it, but I will be asking you afterwards what you think about it, and you'll see why I'm going to compare it with another clip later in the lecture, at the end of the lecture. So let's watch the opening of an episode of Planet Earth. First of all, notice the Hollywood music. We did this way back in, I think in week 2, we talked a little bit about this already. In fact, we specifically did this. I think, do you remember which one we looked at before? Was it Pole Mountains or Fresh Water? I can't remember. It doesn't matter. I think we chose mountains before. Shall we choose another one? What would you like? Pole to pole or fresh water? Pole to pole. We are outer space. It's creating the illusion, myth of objective external reality. No human being is outside of reality, but it's creating through the screen the idea that there is a way of looking at the earth that's universal, not political, not cultural, etc., etc. Okay? That's impossible, because what I'm going to say at the end of the lecture is that if you look at the problems of civilization, culture, capitalism, my culture students know this, patriarchy, the world is not united. It's not singular. There is no one singular godlike position. But this is the traditional BBC approach that creates an effect on you, the audience. So in your minds, you start creating the idea that there is a neutral position about the earth. Okay? Nothing is neutral. Everything is political. Right? We'll talk more about this when we do documentary later, but first of all, voiceover. David Attenborough. Very familiar voice, the voice of authority. He's telling you how to interpret the images. Right? That has a strong effect on you. You trust his voice. He's got a great voice. Yeah? He's a lovely man. He's doing fantastic things in the world today. But this is just a general point about the use of a male voice, shall we even say a patriarchal voice, BBC is very patriarchal, to create truth, yeah? To make the audience trust, believe in the reality of the images that are being shown with the voiceover. Seducing us, relaxing us, yeah? Escaping into the beauty of the world when we all have had a very hard, stressful day, go home, watch beautiful BBC documentary. Okay. That's a wonderful image that perfectly illustrates the mass society critique that I mentioned at the beginning. The idea is that all of those birds, each individual bird, obviously you can see there's probably hundreds of thousands of birds there, maybe even millions. They are like people, and the power of the media is that they can all be influenced by the media. That's the mass society critique. Yeah? It's the outside transcendent power. Okay. There's a lot to get through today, so I can't show you any more of that particular clip. Maybe we could return to it in the seminar. My question to you now is, okay, what do you think about this BBC documentary as an audience? Let me just ask you 3 questions. Do you accept it as truthful? Do you reject it? Or do you think there's some bits about it that I like that are true, some bits about it that I don't like that maybe I don't think are true? Do you accept it? Do you negotiate it? Do you reject it? What do you guys think?
Negotiate.
Great, Fan, but I want to talk to somebody else. Somebody else? Fan says she negotiates it. Anybody else want to say something? Somebody on this side.
Accept,
You accept it. Why?
because it looks very authoritative.
Okay, it looks, so there's an interesting point there in terms of media effects. It looks true. Why do we trust images more than words?
It's just like the simple bit. And
We put more faith in, it's like science, technology, yeah? A camera is neutral, isn't it? So if you film nature, it's truthful. But do you not think that the way these images are edited, the way these images don't show some of the horrible things that are happening in the world in terms of nature, don't you think that's missing? Yeah? So one of the arguments that I'm going to make at the end of the lecture to compare and contrast the 2 texts is that it's no exaggeration to say, even in mainstream science now, that this beautiful planet that planet Earth is documenting, it was made a few years ago now, is being murdered by human beings. It's being destroyed. Right? Do we see that in this image, in these images? No. So, from the perspective of power, and I'm talking particularly about ideology, remember we talked a lot about this in the last couple of weeks, capitalist power, from a political economic perspective, if you can get people to believe that the world is fine, that capitalism is fine, there's no problem, yeah, then you're going to make these kinds of programs, right? Because it just keeps people calm and carrying on, yeah? And I would say that's a big media effect of this kind of documentary. If you just watch this and you don't really know how bad the state of the world and the environment is, you're going to have a totally false idea of human reality on this planet. Yeah? Now, you said you accepted it, and therefore you are being lied to, partly. But maybe you accept it on an emotional level, because just like in advertising culture, as we discussed before, it's our desire that we accept. We want to believe that everything's going to be okay, like a Hollywood movie, yeah? With a happy, feel-good ending. All right? You'll see what I mean, because especially the culture students, the clip I'm going to show you at the end, sorry, it's from the thing that I showed you on Friday, yeah? Remember? Planet Earth versus patriarchy, but anyway, we'll come to that in a moment. Let's get back to the lecture notes. I think we could use a bit more light. Okay, so we're up to the critical tradition now, and this links very nicely with what we talked about 2 weeks ago in the context of the Frankfurt School, Adorno and Horkheimer being 2 of the most prominent voices of the Frankfurt School. They talk about the culture industry, so they, political economists, as I already mentioned, but also the Frankfurt School, have a lot in common with media effects theories in seeing the audience, the masses, being pacified, being brainwashed, being misinformed, being distracted, right? That's links with the Frankfurt School. critique. Frankfurt School argue that the ideological Western mass media, it makes us stupid. It standardizes us. Yeah, it discourages critical. It stops us from being active mentally. Yeah, it dominates us ideologically. Political economy research on media effects is very concerned with the media industry, as we know, particularly concerned with power, concentrations of power, ownership. Political economists who research media effects, they assume that the media has strong effects. One of the problems with the political economic approach to studying media effects is it doesn't actually do much research on audiences. It produces a lot of theory, like the Frankfurt School, but it's not social scientific. There is very little actual research on audiences. And one branch of research that did try to record, to discuss, to make observations about the effect of media on human beings is called behaviorism. It's the behaviorist tradition. It's called experimental research. So experimental research, behaviorism, concentrates on the direct effects of the media on our cognition, on our brains, on our minds. It claims to be scientific. Why? Because it's conducted in laboratories, scientific spaces. Yeah? So what happens in experimental media effects research is that you go into a laboratory and you're wired up to equipment, and probably a man in a kind of white overall takes notes, and you're like a guinea pig. Yeah? That's the scientific approach. Now, one very famous approach that was carried out many years ago, I think way back in the 60s, related to what we call social learning theory, is the Bobo doll experiment. Has anyone heard of it? This is basically, when you read, if you read the key texts on media effects, they'll always refer to the historic Bobo doll experiment. A Bobo doll is a large inflatable doll that if you push it or you punch it, it comes back up again. Yeah? So it doesn't fall over. And what they decided to do, scientifically, quite a crude piece of research, I suppose, was that they focused on children, because they were, as we know, media effects is concerned with violence, it's concerned on TV, media violence and how that affects children's minds. So children were put in the laboratory. They would watch some violent media, they'd see some violence on the screen, and then they would interact with the doll to see whether, after they watched the violence, whether that made them more violent still, and they were asked to either, push the doll it's a kind of way of measuring how angry they were or how violent they were. And what do you think the conclusion of the research on children being made violent by violent media was? Well, the conclusion was that exposure to rewarded violence affects behaviour. In other words, basically that means that if you get a reward, if you watch violence and you get some pleasure from it, reward, then you're more likely to be violent. So what's interesting, maybe I'll explain that more in the seminar later, but I don't want to go into any particular detail now. What's interesting about the Bobo doll experiment is it's often used by governments to justify regulation. So one of the big debates in media studies is how regulated should the media be. The results of the Bobo doll experiment allegedly prove that violence does influence children's behaviour negatively, so governments use that evidence to say we need to control the media, we need public service broadcasting, we need regulation. But the problem with the fact that governments are using the Bobo doll experiment as evidence for regulation, as an argument for regulation, is that they're doing it in a political way so that they don't have to take responsibility for why people are violent in the first place. Yeah? Because it's not just, does the media does violent media make people violent? It's why are people violent in the first place? And actually, there's a much bigger question, which is Western society in particular, most capitalist countries have high levels of violence, very simply because of capitalism. Crime is higher in capitalist countries because it causes more social envy and people, and as we all know when in the context of advertising, advertising does not include poor people in it. So poor people are exposed, media effects, there you go, they're exposed to the media effects of advertising, that when all these beautiful, desirable products, but they don't have the money to be able to consume it. Therefore, they commit violence. So governments want to distract from the fact that actually capitalism causes violence by saying it's the media that makes people violent. It's violent media. Yeah? We can talk more about that later. I'm just mindful of the time. I want to get through a few more points and then we'll get through the clip at the end. So the problem with the Bobo doll experiment, the problem with scientific laboratory media effects research is it's artificial. Nobody watches media in a scientific laboratory. We watch it in our homes, we watch it on our phones when we're travelling around. So different contexts are going to produce different results. If I put you in a scientific laboratory and measure media effects on you, it might not be the same as if you're at home, right? So it's a false context. Also, experimental research only focuses on short-term effects, immediate effects. Actually, you could argue that the real effects of the media on people's behaviour is long-term. It happens over years and years and years. And actually, the results of experimental research, behaviourist research, they are mixed. They're by no means conclusive. They're contradictory, right? So it's not clear that media. Actually, I would say if you are measuring, if you're recording a direct correlation between children exposed to media violence becoming more violent, it's probably because they're violent in the first place. It's probably because their parents are violent. It's probably because they're born into a poor working class background where violence is normal. Yeah? But that's the danger of focusing on media violence. You're not looking at the social causes of violence. Right? And that's why governments like it, because then governments don't get blamed for the political causes of social violence. I think, let's just see how much we've still got to go yet. I'm going to go through this a bit quickly, so forgive me, and then we'll go into more detail in the seminars if and where necessary, but I'm still mindful of showing you the clip. So now we move to liberal pluralist research. So think to last week when we talked about pluralist approaches. Now, next week I'm going to talk about active audience approaches. Liberal pluralist approaches are kind of between media effects and active audience. So liberal pluralist research starts to look at interpersonal media effects, opinion leaders. So this is the idea that we all belong to social networks. If we watch something in the media that stimulates us, that changes our political minds, actually what we're likely to do is to check with somebody who, in authority, in our family, or maybe at school, if you're a young person at school, and then an opinion leader will actually affect your opinion about whether the media is truthful or not. It's a much more complex story, media effects. We're not just, what makes us think that something's true or not. Yes, the media influences us, but it's also the social context in which we consume the media. It's not. So the danger of media effects research is it just looks at the text. It just looks at the direct effect of, okay, you've got a violent text here, and this person was violent, but it doesn't look at the context of that person's real life who's consuming the media. So, liberal pluralist research changes the focus. Research changes the focus. They are more concerned with not what the media do to people, that's media effects, but what people do with the media. Do you see? Different emphasis. The idea is that as individuals, we have agency, right? Media effects is obsessed with structure and power. But actually, liberal pluralist research says, no, it's how we use the media that's important, not what the media does to us. Different emphasis altogether. Different political assumptions. So, and this leads to what I'm going to say next week under the umbrella heading of uses and gratifications research. So the next historic research that happened in the 70s and 80s was basically media anthropologists, media researchers going into people's homes and observing how people use the media in their home domestic environment. Maybe a researcher living with a family for weeks, if not months, very different from a couple of hours in a laboratory, looking at how people actively use the media, and looking for. So media effects theories are really concerned with the same effect on everybody, ideology, right? Whereas liberal pluralist researchers, active audience researchers, are more concerned with different effects. I might play. This is what the two clips are about today. I might play. We can discuss this. That's the reason why I'm doing this. The Planet Earth clip that I showed you, I suggest people had different interpretations, not the same interpretation, right? And the same for the clip that I'm about to show you. So active audience, liberal pluralist researchers, they're concerned with difference, not sameness. Let's go to the clip. Actually, for the culture studies students, don't worry, you haven't seen this part of the video before. It's new. So the same as the BBC clip that I already showed you. Just think about, you haven't seen this before, and at the end I'm going to ask you as an audience, do you believe the information that this this documentary clip is showing you? How does it make you feel? Is it more truthful than the BBC Planet Earth? It's a very different media. So I'm concerned to see, does it have the same effect on you? Do you all believe it? Do you reject it? Are there differences in your interpretation? So here we go.
Agriculture is all, and more sophisticated hunting techniques. There's definitely barter going on, and there's art. So in very number, one season of also feel age. Second system, and it is so undisputedly. We don't actually know. None of the explanations actually match the facts. The only explanation that makes even halfway sense to me is the fact that these particular not for anything.
Okay, let's turn the lights down. Okay, so this is a radical feminist. She's talking about the relationship between planet Earth and patriarchy, and she's focusing on capitalism. Okay, just think, be honest, that's the most important thing. When she gives you her arguments, her very political, radical feminist arguments, do you agree with her? Right? If you disagree with her, why do you disagree? Is it because you're so used to watching BBC media and commercial media that paints a very different picture of the world? Or is it because she's wrong? Right? So this is a media effects experiment now.
So can't do it. We don't know. That may be the explanation that actually matches the facts. So, all right, well that was civilization. On to capitalism. Second system that's destroying the planet, capitalism. And then ultimately it's civilization on steroids. Capitalism takes living creatures in their homes it turns them into private property, then converts them to dead commodities, and accumulates those commodities into wealth. It's a pyramid scheme of death. The Occupy movement has staked its claim on being the 99%. I think that's actually obvious, right? Capitalism is the 1%, stealing from the 99%. The only thing we should add to that is that 98% of the old growth forests are gone, and 99% of the world's prairies are gone.
Just think what she's saying. 98%, 99% of the world's forests and prairies are gone, right? That leaves what, 1%, 2%? Go back to the Planet Earth documentary. Do you have any sense that we've lost 99% of the forests in that BBC documentary that claims to be objective and truthful? No, right? Do you see the difference? You know, it's rather different, isn't it? It's not just what you see, it's a fact. BBC's just showing you images that create the reality. This is a fact. You can't see something that's not there because it's gone, right? But you can tell someone, like she's doing.
And that means 99% of the path flowers, and 99% of the bison, and 99% of the prairie dogs, they're gone. So this is a pyramid scheme of death. And the point to me is not should we distribute the wealth, it's to stop the death while there is still something left alive. Now I love this poster. This is the IWW. We rule you, we fool you, we shoot you. I just think this is perfect. The only part missing is that the very bottom layer really should be the women. The women and the girls. So I think if a feminist drew it, it might look like this. I have not been able to find anybody to translate this yet. I'm not even sure we need a translation to get the general idea. You got the big guy sitting on the little guy, and they're both sitting on the woman, who's doing the basic sustenance work to keep them all alive. And on that note, I just want to recognize the women who've been working in the kitchen and how hard they've been working. But we know what this picture means because we also know that poverty has a woman's face. Okay, so I'm going to assume we basically get that capitalism is a problem in this room, which is a nice thing to be able to assume, I have to say. But just briefly, here's why. The goal of capitalism is the creation of wealth. It's not to provide for human needs. So what that means is, well, first of all, it's brand new. I mean, people have only been doing capitalism for maybe 300 years. In fact, there's some economic historians who put the exact year of 1834. Because until that point, land or labor are not really commodified. But after 1834, they absolutely are. What drives a capitalist economy is a ceaseless quest for more wealth, which means for more investment opportunities. So the wealthy people have capital. They want to invest it in something that will make more profit for them. The only way they're going to do that is if there is an ever-increasing number of investment opportunities. What that means is people have to consume more. Every year they have to consume more so that there are more investment opportunities for the wealthy. In fact, if the economy does not grow by about 3% a year, it crashes. Another way to say that is that all the consumption happening on the planet has to double every 20 years.
Which means that more forests have to die, the sea becomes more polluted, less fish, less animals, species extinction and so on. So you get the picture. She's painting a very, very different picture to David Attenborough. David Attenborough, forgive him, is a brilliant campaigner today for climate change. He's changed. He's in his 90s and he's changed. He does not make documentaries like Planet Earth anymore. He's very worried about Planet Earth because he's actually listened to people like her. Yeah? So good for him, right? But you see in terms of effects and audiences what I'm driving at. So, you've only seen a couple of minutes, okay? It doesn't have the wonderful music, it doesn't look spectacular, it doesn't have high production values, it's just like this classroom, it's like a simple person with an audience speaking. As a text, do you agree with her? Do you disagree with her? What do you think? I want one person from this side of the room to speak and then somebody from the other side. Somebody who hasn't spoken so far will be great. And be honest, I'm not trying to make you all into radical feminists, although it would be nice, right? You don't have to become like her. I'm just saying, do you believe what she's saying? Why or why not? Don't be shy. This won't affect your assessment on the course because I'm filming it, right?
I'm not I believe her, but I'm not 100% believe what she's talking about, especially the statistics data. So
Okay.
how she can manage get the data like.
So you'd like to see the actual sources of the statistics?
Yes, how
That's a
she
good
gets
point.
it.
That's a good point. Okay. How about somebody over here?
So give us a different region to see the relationship between us and the capitalism or the agriculture. This is different region. With this region, with this class, is just special.
Are you saying, both of you maybe, that she's biased? That she's politically subjective? That she's not neutral?
She's quite negative.
Are you being an active audience now? Don't you think, though, when you see somebody who's saying something new, it is that we always, socially and psychologically, we always tend to panic. We always tend to sort of think, well, not necessarily panic, but to say we're critical. We're like, well, where's the evidence? If you're used to watching BBC documentaries, BBC News, whatever it is, the truth is constructed over a long period of time. If someone comes along and bursts your bubble and says, actually, that's all ideology and what's missing, of course you're going to try to reject it at the beginning. Of course, like Fanny, you're going to say, show me the evidence. Of course you're going to say, oh, hang on a minute, I'm not convinced. Maybe this is a bit distorted, you haven't showed me this part of the world, you're just talking about one part of the world. But do you see my point? But what I've shown you today are two very different media texts, right? And I think, I mean, it's very hard for us to think about this ourselves, but which one do you think is more powerful? The first text, the BBC text, or the Leah Keith radical feminist text? Which one's more?
Absolutely, the BBC.
It's more powerful
Yes.
because
Because BBC is a public broadcasting, so has more audience, have more power to influence all the audience.
But does that
She
say? Does that mean then that you're kind of rejecting what Leah Keith is saying? Because
No.
no.
No, I'm not saying
So
that.
I still think this has power too.
Because
Yeah.
motivation is different, but maybe BBC working for something, for somebody, but she's an individual. As an individual, she has a motivation as she wants to let audience see the truth.
Okay.
She has no benefit.
So out of the two theories, I mean, I'm going to say a lot more next week about active audience theory. Which one do you think matches your experiences of today? Are you a passive media effects audience, or are you an active audience? Which one are you?
But we are changing.
Pardon?
We are on the way changing.
It's both, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's not
Yeah.
media effects or active audience. Clearly, the media has a powerful effect on us, right?
Yeah.
But it doesn't have a powerful effect on all of us in the same way. And part of the whole point of teaching media studies, and why I've been doing it for years, and so on and so forth, is to actually make you more critically active as audiences. Yeah? It's not fixed. You can teach people to be more active, right? And that's the point, isn't it? But if people in schools, and traditionally in schools people don't talk about media, right? Then they're more likely to be more passive if they don't question the power of the media that they're consuming. Right? So this is the whole point, making it more critical. Any last minute questions or points? I will stop there. Thank you. See you on Friday. See you on Friday. I'm now going to go and do some yoga. Yeah, it's my yoga night.
Yoga thinking. Yoga thinking.
Yoga thinking?
Yeah.
What's that?
Just to relax and thinking.
Oh yeah, I mean yoga's really, for someone that kind of thinks too much, yoga's perfect because it restores the balance between your mind and your body.
Deep thought. The deep thought. Meditation. Meditation. 默念冥想 meditation. Yoga and meditation. Deep thought. Yoga and
Contemplation.